Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to this conversation about behavioral profiling in the area of voting. I am Chris Hoofnagle. I am a professor at the UC Berkeley School of Information and at the School of Law. I'm delighted to be part of this panel, although I'm just the chair, so I'm going to introduce everyone and get out of the way so that we can get to the conversation. We have a fantastic group of experts to talk about this issue. They include Claes de Vreese. Was that decently right?
Kind of right.
Kind of right? Will you say it so more correctly?
Claes de Vreese.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to work on that. Claes is a professor and chair of political communication at the University of Amsterdam. He's the founding director of the Center for Politics and Communication, and he played a big role in putting together this panel. We have Professor Frank Pasquale, an old friend, author of the recent book Unlocking the Black Box and the Black Box Society. Excuse me, it's the Black Box Society, which was just published by Harvard University Press, and it's a very important book about the rise of algorithms and automated decision making. It's definitely worth reading. We have Gabriela Zanfir, who has a PhD in law, and her thesis is on the rights of data subjects from the perspective of their adjudication in civil law, and an LLM in human rights. She now works for the European Data Protection Supervisor in the area of policy and consultation. Great to have you, Gabriela. And we also have Frederik Borgesius. In fact, I wanted to introduce you last because you're going to be taking over as moderator. So let me go back to Sunshine Hillygus. Professor Sunshine Hillygus is a political scientist at Duke University, and she directs the Duke Initiative on Survey Methodology. It's known as the DISM. Her research and teaching specialties include public opinion, survey methods, campaigns and elections. She's the author of several books, including The Hard Count, The Social and Political Challenges of the 2000 Census, and The Persuadable Voter. And she's a deep expert in micro-targeting. It's great to have you, Sunshine. And then finally, our moderator is Frederik Borgesius, who is part of an important project at the University of Amsterdam on political communication. His PhD thesis is fantastic. It's one of the deepest explorations of behavioral targeting out there, and it's well worth reading. So Frederik, why don't you take it over from here?
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to be brief. I'm going to start at that side of the table to ask all panel members to give a brief introduction, then we'll do one more round with reactions among the panel members, and then we'll ask you for very brief, everything please, questions or remarks as well, so you can start thinking about your questions already. Sunshine, floor is yours.
Thank you for the invitation to be here and for everyone coming late in the afternoon. I know I'm staying in the way of drinks, cocktails. So I thought with a panel like this that I should make 3 points, mainly just because 3 points is nice and concise. But hopefully in those 3 points, I can give you a little bit of an overview of micro-targeting, largely from a US perspective. But one of the things that we are seeing is that many of the political consultants are now taking their services abroad. So many of these same techniques are now being applied in other countries. So of my 3 points, the first one is that micro-targeting is not new. It actually dates back to the 1800s. Candidates have always attempted to use the information that they have and use it strategically to communicate with voters. The difference is we are now in an environment in which there is more information about individual voters than ever before. The computing power to be able to do sophisticated modeling with that information, and new communication technologies that allow candidates to send different messages to different voters. And so, again, I think the incentives have always been there, but the infrastructure and information is what is new, and frankly is changing constantly with each new election cycle. My second point is that the basis for micro-targeting, for political targeting, in the United States is voter files. And that's slightly different in other countries, but just to get a sense of why this is relevant, particularly for a conference like this, is that voter files are information that individuals provide to the government, their name, address, in some states party registration, and then some other administrative information that goes with it, and are often not told that this information will be turned over to candidates' parties automatically, but also in some states sold to businesses for use, provided to academics for use, and so why this is important is that these voter files provide two important pieces of information that are critical to predicting what it is that candidates need to know in order to develop their campaign strategy. One is they have party registration in some states. In other states, they have, if you voted in a primary, those of you following U.S. politics, right, are reminded of our crazy selection process. Either way, if you vote in a Democratic primary versus Republican primary, it gives you a pretty good predictor if somebody is affiliated with the Republican Party versus the Democratic Party. That information is incredibly predictive of how likely someone is to support one party over the other. The other really critical piece of information in the voter files is turnout history. If someone has shown up in previous elections. With those two pieces of information, which then get matched to consumer information as well as donations to candidates, magazine subscriptions, if you are a registered gun owner, and every other bit of piece of information that campaigns can come up with, the campaigns are able to model two important pieces of information. The likelihood that someone is to support their candidate and the likelihood someone is to vote. Using those probability models, they then decide who do we want to target and who do we want to ignore. And as we get to the Q&A, I suspect a lot of what we'll be talking about are the kind of normative implications of ignoring some people in the electorate and putting a lot of resources into other parts of the electorate. So I guess the key thing I would say is, one is, yes, this is a big data. Let's draw information from lots of different sources, but fundamentally it rests on information that voters give to the government, that they have to give to the government in order to register to be eligible to vote. Third point. That while voter files are the basis for most of the microtargeting that we see today, what we see is that's constantly expanding. And when we look at microtargeting, say online, on Facebook, and other places, that we have to remember that the type of information that is available is different depending on the particular communication platform. So that means that the type of messaging that candidates can use is going to be very much dependent on what information they have. When we're talking about online advertising, oftentimes that's cookies or search histories, right? And it is not necessarily matched up to offline information. And so again, thinking of the normative implications, is candidates are altering their campaign messages depending on the information that they have about voters. And so that means in different platforms, they're communicating different messages with different priorities. And from a normative perspective, we have to think about whether that's a good thing for democracy or not. So I will stop with those 3 points and turn the floor over.
Oh, thank you very much, Sunshine. Then we'll immediately go to Frank.
Thank you so much, Sunshine. That is such an illuminating picture of the landscape. And I'm going to look at a few legal perspectives and normative perspectives on this targeting. One of the things that I think is most important to start the conversation with is that I've seen at least one poll that stated that 84% of Americans do not want behavioral targeting. And you can imagine in political ads. And you can imagine why, right? I mean, you see the rise of anti-system parties around the world, ranging from Le Pen to Trump, because people feel like they are being manipulated. And what better way to manipulate people than to sort of put forward or base a message and have entirely different or tailored messages based on their backgrounds or knowing certain things about them. Now, of course, there are some safeguards there, right? I mean, we could hope for if a candidate is saying directly opposite things to certain individuals, saying to say seniors over 65, I'm going to make better pensions or give you better health care, and then saying to people under 30, it's time to stop those greedy geezers from taking up all of the all the public funds. You know, we hope that will be caught. But I think that one of the lessons of empirical social science about online platforms, and I was just at a roundtable on black boxed platform design at the LSE on Monday, is that a lot of social scientists find that it's getting increasingly difficult to do that type of study for a variety of reasons. Christian Sandvig has cataloged them. And so I think that is a very worrisome thing. I also want to note that I think that the future of targeted behavioral advertising in the political sphere, or things like it, there are several reasons to think that the American model is going to sort of sweep the world, because it is just such a powerful way. These are the new media. These are the way people are really interacting. But on the other hand, a lot of the U.S. landscape might be parochial or unique, given the extremely aggressive interpretations of the First Amendment by the U.S. Supreme Court. So if we wanted to see, for example, laws limiting the ability of entities to target individuals in the political context, you not only have a long line of Supreme Court cases that talk about free expression in the political sphere, you also have a case called IMS Health versus Sorrell, which was about very sophisticated targeting of messages to doctors by drug firms. And I can't go so far as to say that the Supreme Court recognized a right to target, but there was some very powerful language there about giving these entities the ability to gather such information. So I think that the final point that I want to make is that we should watch the recent research by people like Phil Howard, the Political Bots website, Tim Huang, for international uses of bots. I've noticed, for instance, that say when there's political upheaval, there are certain entities that will flood hashtags and will do other things to sort of interfere with or otherwise corrupt the public sphere. And I think what this points out is that we're going to really be relying greatly on large platforms like Facebook, Twitter, others, to conscientiously govern political discourse. And it's going to be a huge challenge. I know they've already had huge challenges with respect to allowing people to have terrorism-related sites or certain, radical political sites on being promoted there. And I think that that's going to be something where ideally there will be a more global governance contributing to that, rather than having all the decisions made in one small part of the United States. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Frank. Then over to Gabriela.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you for your interventions. And well, there have been a lot of media reports recently that the success of the US model of making political campaigns, electoral campaigns using behavioral targeting is slowly being imported into the EU. So this is also the reason why I want to make this first point, that EU data protection law and the EU data protection regime under Directive 95/46 fully applies to all behavioral targeting, political behavioral targeting of individuals within the EU. Maybe this was obvious for some people in the audience, but I think this is an important point to make because there are specific rules that can address political behavioral targeting. And for instance, I refer here to the fact that political opinions are classified as sensitive data under both the Directive 95/46 and the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. And as all of you may already know, processing of sensitive data is in principle forbidden, and they can be processed only on in exceptional cases, and only if appropriate safeguards are provided for. And then, of course, there are the rules about profiling. There are the rules about the right to object, and there are the rules about data transfers. And this is also very important because, as it turns out, a lot of American-based companies offer these services purposes. So therefore, whenever they process and they make profiles of persons within the EU, they would have to comply with the complicated landscape, the complicated issue of international data transfers from the EU to the US. This is just an introductory point, so I can go deeper into the rules later on. The second point I want to make is that this issue has been on the radar of data protection authorities since 2005, for sure. And I say that because we have a resolution that was adopted in Montreal in 2005 by the data protection authorities who met in the framework of the International Conference of Privacy Commissioners, and they adopted a resolution. I'm going to quote the title because I don't, it's the resolution on the use of personal data for political communication. So those of you who are curious to see how data protection authorities see harmonized see these issues, you can look in this resolution because it applies the general data protection principles to this sort to political communication. For instance, the data minimization principle. So we can have here the question of whether you can collect data, personal data, for research purposes, create psychological profiles of individuals for your research purposes, and then use these profiles for a political campaign. So data minimization would tell you that you cannot do that. So yeah, this is the second point. And the last point I would like to make is that, of course, political behavioral targeting involves much more than data protection. And of course, we go to constitutional law, maybe to political systems. And I would like to just point out here that this is maybe one of the very good examples of data protection being an instrumental right to protect other values and not only private life. So this is something that I was thinking about while preparing the panel based on your questions, Frederik. So this, I think this is important, is an important aspect that we should take into account.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. Immediately we continue to Claes.
Well, thank you, Frederik, and let me then just make one point, since I'm the last one to make introductory remarks, and maybe starting with a bit of a sort of self-disclosure that I think in this debate I would qualify myself as a cautious and somewhat agnostic empiricist, in the sense that I come from a background where I would say, well, let's look at maybe some of the positive and negative consequences of this opportunity for political behavioral targeting. I mean, there's no doubt that this is something that is developing very rapidly. I've seen estimates that in the 2012 US elections, $159 million were spent on digital advertisement, and the projection for 2016 is $1 billion just for digital advertisement. And it is an area that is developing quickly. I don't think anyone would be surprised that if they would be looking at specific newspaper websites that they might see ad banners for specific political parties that have been affiliated with these newspapers for more than 100 years. So in some ways I subscribe to Sunshine's point too, that it's not all new, but I think that some of the consequences for of behavioral targeting in the political realm have both positive and negative opportunities involved. I mean, one thing is using this kind of data and this kind of approach to build brand equity in terms of building the brand of a politician and a candidate. I don't think there's a lot of new and potentially danger in there. We have seen in past decades with dwindling turnout rates in many established democracies that public authorities and governments have invested a lot of money in mobilizing campaigns. You could potentially say that this enables us to use that money much more diligently diligently, because now you can target people who we maybe want to see at the polls in greater numbers, latecomers to new democracies, young people, rather than spending these in broad campaigns where we don't know that they have much effect. There is a huge debate. Any kind of discussion of political campaigning has always been surrounded with a huge fear of new technology. It is not coincidental that television advertising in the realm of politics is still banned in many countries in Europe. It is not coincidental that we cannot publish opinion polls in some countries leading up to elections. So there's always been, I think, an initial fear of new technologies and the things that they can bring. However, if you look at the social science empirical evidence on, for example, television advertising, it's a very mixed bag, and there's at least as much mounting evidence to suggest that it can be mobilizing, at least for some groups, as well as it can be demobilizing. So I think my only point that I want to make after these introductory remark, or as the introductory remark, is to be open for both the, say, the positive and the negative consequences of political behavioral targeting. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Claes. So one more round, super brief, tweet-like remarks, please, and I'm gonna push you also a bit. Should regulators do anything? Because on the one hand, as Frank says, a survey showed that a lot of people dislike behavioral targeting in general, and a survey of Thoreau showed that they especially disliked political behavioral targeting, and I've heard a lot of good reasons to be.
Can I try a question before that one?
Yeah.
To set yours up?
Yeah.
I wonder if you could all comment on what are the who are the important companies, right? Because that might paint the regulatory agenda. So who are the important companies in these practices? Does it make sense? Maybe we start there and then get to the regulatory question?
Makes sense. I know a few American companies, Campaign Grid, who say that they buy data everywhere from data brokers, package it into...
So I'll answer both your questions, actually.
Oh, awesome.
Maybe not in 140 characters. I think it's important to remember the incentives of the actors involved. And in the United States, there is evidence that politicians, right, the very people who are both using this data, right, and making the laws, are making the laws to be, easier for them to use, but perhaps shutting down use by other people. So it's important to remember those incentives. The other thing I would just put in really quickly is that while we want to think about the effects for voters, and oftentimes when we think about the effects for voters, we can consider some more positive effects, where I think the research is more compelling, the evidence is more compelling in response to Claes' very important point that the evidence in terms of the effects on voters is inconclusive. It's really clear to me that it's having an effect on what candidates say, how they spend their money, right, in terms of how they are driving the dynamics of campaign messaging. And so, in terms of where I feel like we can say the science has given us clear evidence, voter effects less clear, but candidate effects very clear.
Super interesting. Okay, then I'll go to Frank, but I'm going to throw one more thing in, because meanwhile, political speech is also the most important type of speech, so usually you must be super careful, even more careful than normal with regulating it, because political speech and channels for political speech are rightly the most protected types of speech. But Frank, perhaps any more tweet-like thoughts?
So, I think that one thing that is important to try to distinguish, but maybe very difficult to empirically distinguish, is when are these types of ads really informing, contributing to a deliberative process, and when are they more targeted at, say, catalyzing turnout, right? And the worry I have about the latter effect is that we're already seeing in many areas a commodification of speech and a commodification, and the problem is that, to come to the US context again, getting into the companies that Chris had asked about, you have, Jack Balkin has an article where he describes the party as database. And he says that essentially political parties have they've been weakening so much that in some ways the most important function they had in the US context was to be a database of people who might vote for you. But now you have the Koch brothers with an incredibly sophisticated network of operations that may well be more data savvy than the Republican Party itself. So you really have great questions about the potential for data oligarchies to develop on the basis of such data collection and an intensification of already strong trends toward commodifying the ability to win office. So I would just, the other example I would give about the corporate structure here that is a big theme of recent work on data gathering is that there's this centrifugal pull toward monopolization. And so even like the Democratic Party, which you'd think would be somewhat mindful of this, was incredibly reliant on one firm. Is the firm like DT Link? Is that the firm? I forget, but it's one firm. And there was a controversy between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton last month over accessing the data, whether there was a data breach, et cetera. But when you have just one firm in control, that can give that entity a great deal of leverage vis-a-vis the parties.
Thank you, Frank. Gabriela?
Yes, thank you. I will also try to answer both questions. So in terms of the first question, well, actually the second one, which are the main actors here? Well, I do not know to name names, but speaking from the point of view of you data protection lawyer, let's say, for us the main actors are in terms of controllers and processors, and what matters here is whether the controllers, meaning the people, the entity processing the data, whether they are within the EU or within other third countries. So then we would know exactly whether the rules on data transfers apply to them or not, or or not. So from this point of view, this is the only answer I can give. As for whether there is a need for regulatory action, I would say let's first try the strength of data protection law, because I think it's quite well regulated, and let's try to use its strength on this particular matter. And then see whether there is need for further action. Thank you.
Yeah, careful, makes sense. Claes?
Yeah, let me maybe just point out that it is beyond all doubt that at the system level you have seen massive changes, and that's for sure. But maybe in some ways that's also good, right? A little less spent on TV advertisement in the US is probably a good thing. But what I really wanted to say is I also think that there's not only a difference in the, say, the regulatory regime, but also in the political system that really is important for understanding the scope and the nature of this beast. And in many of the elections and votes that we see, especially in the European context, we are not in a situation where we can say, well, let's target this block, or it's actually less interesting to say, let's target this block in this neighborhood, in this little swing state, because that is what's going to drive what the rest of Europe is doing. And that is a big, important, maybe advantage of many of the electoral systems here, that incentive is actually not so great to do this kind of very disproportionate micro-targeting to only get out those few votes in those few key areas that can swing a state for an entire election. And that's going to be a major qualifier. However, and that also then comes back to the regulatory regime, that may also be that we should be looking at other things as maybe much more important. That also means that it's not only data brokers that are important, but in the area of micro-targeting, things like Facebook will be an incredibly important player in Europe, especially also with the research suggesting the importance of having all kinds of news feeds that are endorsed in your friend circle. And this kind of data, which is actually maybe more influential in I would say in a European context currently, is maybe a more important actor to look at right now.
Thank you, Claes. Now I'll give the mic for a bit to Chris, and then I'm going to take 3 questions from the audience. Again, tweet like short. Please, then we reply, we get more questions, etc. First, Chris.
While you formulate your questions, let me try one more kind of logistical question. I think it'd be worthwhile for this audience to hear about the actual steps that are taken. What are the data inputs for voter profiling in this sense? And how do they get aggregated? I mean, are we talking about search? Like, if I search for something, is that pouring into a voter profile? And how does the profiling actually touch me as citizen? Is it going to come through the mail, like the postal mail? Am I going to see it on Facebook? I'm wondering if some of the mechanics of this are really important because it is not easy to get people's attention. So it seems that when we think about regulatory options, some of the options are around the data, some of the options are around the platforms, and it'd be useful to hear a bit about that.
So I can certainly say that the mechanics shape both the messages, right, and the data source. So for instance, Facebook is actually a trickier example because people tend to use their real name, and so it is easier. One of the things they can do, right, a campaign can feed a list of names to Facebook that receive different messages. But that's very different from most of the online targeting and online messaging that you get, which is much more likely to be dependent on online activities and behaviors, right? And so what you see online tends to reflect what you're doing online, whereas what shows up in your mailbox, what shows up in your phone messages, those type of micro-targeting is a reflection of what they have in those voter files combined with voter information. So I will say from the standpoint of the monopolies, it's a great point because there are a few companies that on either side of the aisle are developing these major databases. They take the voter files, which again, it varies by states. Some states you can go ahead and go in and download for free. If you want to go search and see my name, my address, my gender, my party registration, and my turnout history, just go to the North Carolina Board of Education and put my name in and you'll find it, right? So there are some states where everything is just absolutely available. In other states, you have to have some rationale for asking for it, unless you're a candidate or party, and then it's assumed you can just have it and they automatically transfer it. But these companies take those voter files and then match, because they now have your name and your address and some identifying information about you, match to credit card records. They match, and then they build profiles using modeling, right, where they figure out, are you a homeowner, right, are you a gun owner, and they come up with variables that are politically relevant. After they have this database, the question then, how do you apply that to your decision making as a candidate? You take a large survey of about 5,000 people sampled out of that file, and then go do an in-depth survey asking people's opinions, their likelihood of supporting a candidate, and then you do a massive data mining because you now have that full database along with really detailed issue information and candidate-based information where you can establish, right, the categories of the type of people who look like the people in the surveys to figure out which are your persuasive targets, which are your mobilization targets. And I think going back to Frank's point about mobilization, is that better or worse than persuasion? My concern is the fact that there's a whole bunch of people that just get ignored entirely, right? So if we are allowing the parties to be the mechanism by which our democracy is mobilizing voters, it's failing. It's failing because parties don't have an incentive to mobilize everyone. They're using lots of information they have to be strategic, to only mobilize those individuals that have some chance of supporting them. And so that means that, yes, Obama had an incentive to reach out to a lot of people who weren't registered, who were young, and who were African American. Republicans weren't. In this election cycle, it's less clear that they will, right? So yes, there are circumstances under which the huge pool of people who are not in the system and not engaged in politics might be reached, might be mobilized, but oftentimes they're ignored, and especially in midterm elections, congressional elections, nobody's touching those people who aren't active voters, and I think that's a bad thing for democracy.
Good point. Now the other panel members have to hold their thoughts for a bit because we're going to take 3 brief questions. Please start with also briefly saying who you are, and we'll collect 3 and then we'll react. I see one at the left. Yeah, right there.
That looks like a person.
Yeah.
Hi. It's on. It's on. Okay. On. Hi. Tim Edgar from Brown University. I guess my question really goes to the issue of are there particular aspects of micro-targeting that are core to the political process, that are basically the 21st century equivalent of knocking on the doorstep, and that if you restricted those under the Data Protection Authority, you're essentially restricting something that's very much a fundamental right. And I guess the question is, can you imagine, I guess it's a legal and an ethical question, if you're confronted with this and you say, I'm looking at the data protection regulation and you violated it, but then I look at the activity, and actually this is core to the political process. This is exactly what political parties have done. They're just doing it in a 21st century way. How do you deal with that? I mean, you can't violate somebody's fundamental rights just because you've got a data protection regulation over here that says you're supposed to.
Good point.
Thank you. I'm Ben Zevenbergen, Oxford Internet Institute. I was wondering if this unhealthy over-reliance of political parties on these voter databases are actually inhibiting any meaningful privacy reform legislation in the US, because it seems self-serving to not have that legislation.
Sort of similar question. I wonder how much of this micro-targeting is influencing the well-known practice of gerrymandering, which seems to be core to what's going on from both sides of the political aisle at the moment in trying to change the political landscape in the US. And I wonder how much of the micro-targeting is informing that process as well.
Thank you. Yep, please jump in.
I guess I'll just jump in very quickly to say, in response to the first question, I do think that rights of free expression do need to be respected. But what I would also say is, I once did an article about 9 years ago called Reclaiming Egalitarianism in the Political Theory of Campaign Finance Reform. And my closing reflections there were a comparative analysis of the rules of the game in Canada, Germany, France, and the US. And all of the other countries other than the US impose rules in the public sphere that the American Supreme Court would decry as utterly antithetical to free expression values. But I don't think they're any less democracies than the US is. And I don't think that the rights of individuals there are any less than the US rights.
If I may, to address the first and the third question, not a bit, mostly the first question. It's a very good question, and actually in the GDPR there is a recital, it's recital 44, that basically is, I think, identical, with the exception of the first word, with the recital 36 of the preamble of the Directive 95/46, and if I may quote, because it's a short one, whereas where in the course of electoral activities, the operation of the democratic system requires in certain member states that political parties compile data on people's political opinion, well, the processing is considered to be made permitted for reasons of important public interest, provided that appropriate safeguards are established. This recital was transposed as such in the GDPR, so it will be in the future legal framework as well. And it tells us that data protection looked at this issue and considered the issue of the importance of the political speech, in the political game, the democratic game. But it also tells us that while in terms of legal basis, such processing is permitted, so you would have a legal basis for it. However, you still need to have appropriate safeguards in place. And here I can think, for instance, to give an example, of informing the people. But of course, there are other safeguards as well.
I think many European democracies have a long history of actually organizing the political process in a way that is much more intrusive than maybe would be the case if you look at the US case. I mean, a majority of countries have strong public service broadcasters who have very clear rules about what they can do and cannot do. Many countries have rules about and regulations about the number of debates running up to an election, when to publish or not publish, and even collect opinion polls, whether or not to run televised ads. So in that way, I think there are many rules and regulations that are there from a normative perspective to say, well, that is a belief that under these circumstances we have the most appropriate debate and the most appropriate campaign leading up to an election.
Just really quickly, I would just say that the gerrymandering absolutely uses the same data to make decisions about how to cut boundaries. The one difference being in campaign strategy, the states that collect race because of Voting Rights Act legislation, you see it reflected in the type of messaging that candidates do in those states. They're more likely to do race-based targeting. They're more likely to include African Americans in the direct mail pieces and the pictures that they send to those households when they can identify them. With gerrymandering, all of the targeting is done on the basis of partisanship, right? You can't do race-based gerrymandering, so it's all. But essentially, right, you get to the same spot.
Thank you. I'm gonna briefly turn the mic to Chris. Perhaps you could say something to the question about it.
No, I'm happy to. You know, if you read Chris Regan's seminal book on privacy and the political economy of privacy, it's called Legislating Privacy. It's published in like 1996. She discusses the idea that executives are always against privacy law, and it kind of makes sense. Executives want information. They don't want to be limited from access to information. Yet you also, on the other hand, you'll often find support for privacy legislation among Congress people and state legislators who can campaign on privacy and get popular cred for it. But this is an area where literally data companies can walk into Congress and say, you stop us and this is what's going to happen to your campaign. And you know, from my time in Washington, I can tell you that members of Congress have data systems to assess the people who call and contact the office. So they can very quickly tell, if you decide to call your senator or your congressperson, they can very quickly tell if you're a donor, if you're a supporter or not, and that might control your access to that member or not. But I want to turn back to the panel with a new question. So we live in a world where there are different alternatives to problems. We know that politics is a dirty business. Any of you have ever worked on a campaign, you will see people's votes literally being bought, sometimes explicitly and sometimes not. So it's very famous, you know, go drive a bus to a neighborhood, put everybody on the bus and lobby them the whole way, or just pay them to go vote and hope that they vote for your candidate. Will any of this political targeting perhaps take money away from these other type of corrupt practices? So could we be in a better world with this targeting if the alternative is I'm going to get a bag of cash, and that is what happens in the last day of elections. Bags of cash show up, and I'm going to spread it around to get votes. Would it be better if those bags of cash were given to Facebook?
So to be clear, right, that is explicitly illegal, right? So I mean, I guess the thing that I would say is that I love a quote from Mike Dukakis when he was talking about, you know, campaigning for president back in his days. He said, you know, if I walked up the 5 flight of stairs to, you know, go pitch myself, I knock on every door, right? Because I've already walked up the 5 flight of stairs. That's not the case today, right? It's not the case. So, you know, when you get your little handheld and you're a college student that's going out to campaign for a candidate that you believe in, you are told to skip, you know, particular doors in that apartment complex. And so, you know, I think from the standpoint of could we be better off? Do I think it's realistic to make fundamental changes? No. But I think in some ways, going back to the survey that Annenberg did about people's reactions to microtargeting, is that to some extent, perhaps sunlight is the best solution. You know, when you have the vast majority of people who not only are opposed to it, but in this survey, they also report being much more likely to say that they are okay with consumer advertising that is targeted. And they claim, granted, we can talk about public opinion measurement, but claim that they would actually be less likely to support a candidate that used their data in this way. Again, I think we would have a tough road to change a lot of the laws, but to some sense, you know, putting sunlight on it.
Thank you. Could you hold your thoughts for a bit and we take some...
There's a question in the very back. Very back.
Yep.
And I see Natalie has one as well.
Hi, Malte Spitz my name, and I'm also active in politics myself, and also had some national campaigns done over the last years. First point I wanted to ask, and I'm talking more from a European perspective, if it's true what all the companies saying, that in 4, 5, 6 years the political targeting will be so influential that you can really have, like, for a half-year period the targeting of your voters, and then at the day of the vote they say, okay, you have to vote today for this party, and that this really has such an influence. I think it is an impact on our political system that we should talk about, that there should be some sort of regulation in it, like it's regulated how and who can fund political parties, for example, like, because it is so influential that you have an impact on our democratic system. Even that, in the worst case, I would say you have to forbid it, because it is changing our political landscapes that much. And secondly, also from my own views, the point. Can a political party use such methods, even if they are a political party in favor of privacy? Or would you say a political party and candidate who stands up for privacy should say targeting methods aren't okay? Thanks.
Thank you very much. A politician who calls for a ban. This is fun.
Another question that sort of goes into the area of democracy, or the fundamentals of democracy that might be affected by this. Has microtargeting actually changed policy? Is there research on how much shift in policy positions has been affected by slight perceptions of how the voter might like this better than the other, and how sort of it really undermines convictions, ideology, things that you stand for, because you really target your policies now to the micro-targeting audience that is likely to give you a vote for that position over the other policy position?
Professor Hellberger here, and then we could turn to our panelists.
Yeah, sorry.
I would like to build up on the last two questions about the impact and the democratic effects. And as Chris already mentioned, campaigning is very, very expensive. Could it be that these new possibilities of micro-targeting using algorithms, and as we all know, data is out there relatively cheaply, could it be that that also lowers the barriers to entry for smaller parties, so that they could more easily campaign and maybe have a bigger chance to succeed, even though they don't have these bags of cash?
Thank you. Sorry for the audience members who still have to wait. We're going to answer this round, and then we'll get to you. Let's start with Frank. He was waving for a bit already.
Well, I do think that the idea of having a new way for new parties to reach people via this advertising, I think, is very heartening. But the problem is that I think that it is. I don't know how cheap the data is. I guess that would be my question would be, and I guess the other point I guess I would make is that ultimately effectiveness might be predicated on having the access to the most data. And to get to the earlier question about the actual effectiveness of this stuff, I have not looked at studies of the effectiveness of the behavioral targeting so far, but I think there's a very interesting line of research at Facebook that found that if they reminded people of their voting place and to vote on the day of the election, that caused 0.62% more people to vote in their sample. And I think that study raises some interesting questions. One is that in close elections, that 0.62% is quite critical, or could be. Secondly, what Jonathan Zittrain has raised the possibility is that no one would understand or know if that had been done. It'd be very hard to figure that out, who got picked and who didn't. Of course, now I think people are going to be watching that, but but I do think that if you can easily imagine scenarios where that type of black box nature of the intervention could be troubling and could be more subtle.
Yeah, sure. So I'm not that optimistic that I think that the availability of these new mechanisms and opportunities will lead to a dampening of budgets that go into campaigns. But I am maybe a little bit optimistic still about human agency in electoral choices. I think that some of the profound fears have been voiced before, especially on the arrival of television, where there really was an assumption of a massive impact on voters, and I am still, cautiously optimistic enough that for many voters, this is not enough, and this is an add-on. And yes, we see a mounting evidence in the social sciences that many things can have an effect. It can have an effect if you see a published poll that is then described positively in your favorite news source, and which is forwarded to you through Facebook with an endorsement. Yes, it can have a marginal effect if you see a specific type of advertising. There are multiple types of messages in the campaign that can have effects, and this is not the only one. And that's why I think at the end of the day that there can be some optimism for human agency in electoral choices. To the question as to whether or not this will drive parties to have new policy positions, there is evidence. It's not as if parties have only now started to ask electorates. I mean, the idea of the permanent campaigning is, of course, one that's been out there for many years, and it's a constant polling, and basically no policy initiative is floated before some kind of testing, either through focus groups or small polls. So in that sense, I think that this is just yet another instrument for somewhat more granular and maybe much more rapid responses from your constituency or the electorate at large. But as such, it is not a new thing, but it is evidence that parties can move also in response to what polls are showing in between elections. We can have a long debate, and we won't finish that one before the drinks, whether or not that is necessarily and always a bad thing, whether or not some responsiveness on the side of parties in between elections in response to public opinion is necessarily a bad thing. But I don't think we'll solve that debate now.
So I'd love to just add to that, because I actually agree with everything you said, and would just like to elaborate on the fact that beyond those effects that we see on voters with campaign messaging, that one of the difficulties that we face right now is how hard it is to actually study. Because when we think about where you get information about a campaign, it is coming from so many different sources, not just the web ad that's flashing up when you go to a website, not the television ad that you're now skipping over, right? Not the ad that's fed through your Hulu before you watch a show, right? The source of information is so diverse and fragmented that part of what the challenge is for social scientists is to figure out what the effect of microtargeting is, given that people's information about the campaign is so different today than it was, in the 1960s and 70s, when, if you wanted to watch TV at dinner time, you sat down and you had, 3 choices, and everyone was getting the same message about what the campaign was about. I think there's more compelling evidence that microtargeting is changing the behavior of the candidates, not just in terms of how they communicate, but also what they communicate, with implications for polarization. And so in the Persuadable Voter, one of the things that I did was look at the number of issues that was raised in microtargeted direct mail relative to television ads. There were 75 different issues raised in direct mail, right? Nothing near that in television advertising. You had different, so you had the wedge issues like abortion, gay marriage, like all over the place in direct mail. And you don't do that in television advertising because it's more likely to reach people that wouldn't like to hear that position. And so you have a focus on broader, what we call valence issues in television advertising compared to micro-targeting. And that's where I think it's contributing to polarization, is the fact that when you can, what we call dog whistle politics, right? Send a message about an issue on which only those people who want to hear it can hear it and nobody else can hear it, then what you're doing is not changing your position about abortion. You're not changing your position about gay marriage, but you're communicating a priority for a given issue to different sets of voters. And that in communicating that priority to a different set of voters, it creates this democratic dilemma of like, okay, so one person votes for you because of that thing that you've micro-targeted them on. What do you do once you're elected? And all these very disparate groups have now thought that issue that you talked to them about was a priority. One of my favorite examples, and sorry to ramble, but one of my favorite examples comes from the 2006 Michigan race. Well, actually, there's a nice one from 2012 as well. 2006, Michigan governor's race was targeting snowmobile owners because it was a public list, right? They could send out pieces of direct mail just to snowmobile owners talking about snowmobile policy. You might recall in 2006, right, we were concerned about Iraq, the economy, like lots of other things that you would never, buy a television ad about. But that's what was being told to snowmobile owners was an important issue to the candidate. In 2012, Romney sent out a message about Lyme disease in Virginia, right? Like again, right? You're just getting very different issue priorities in these micro-targeted messages, and on issues, right, that the vast majority of the electorate might think, what are you doing talking about that? Like, get back to the economy, get back to education, get back to the big issues, which is what most people care about. And so I think that there is pretty clear evidence that at least in today's environment, right, that candidates are taking stances on more issues than in the past and bringing issues that once weren't as polarized into a more polarized environment.
And the snowmobile issue, I mean, that is really interesting. It probably doesn't translate to a European audience, but there's a lot of Americans who feel very strongly that they should be able to ride their snowmobiles in public parks. Yeah. And it's like a religion, and it motivates people to polls in the same way gun issues, et cetera. But I think your point tees up perfectly an opportunity for Claes and Frederik to more explicitly go into their project on personalized communications, because just as you studied television and direct mail, maybe you could talk a bit about the methods and the ways you can dig into getting to this wealth of communication tools that Sunshine just elucidated.
You jump at it.
So this is, now I get to do free advertising. I'll take the opportunity of that. So yes, we are engaging in a new project where we are putting together people who work in quantitative behavioral social sciences with information lawyers, and there's a steep learning curve on both sides when we're at the same table. But one of the things that we are interested in is political behavioral targeting, and that difficulty of how to study that is one that's very apparent. So over the next 2 years, we'll be doing two things. We'll be doing a survey, which is a panel survey of a national sample in the Netherlands, following developments in this area. What are people's attitudes to targeting in different areas, in the area of health, in the area of politics, and in the area of commercial goods? Because this is a moving target, and also because, well, one thing we note for sure that big scandals will come in this area over the next 2 years. So simply to get a better grasp and also some kind of benchmark to, for example, the studies that have been done at the University of Pennsylvania about where does it become creepy to citizens, and what is actually also the sense of knowledge in this area, and say citizen literacy. And then the other one, which is a bit more also raising some issues for how to do research properly, is that for another sample we will be following the online behavior of about 1,000 Dutch people over the next couple of years, where they will have software installed on their laptops, so that you actually get a sense of what is the degree of targeting. For example, in the realm of politics, we don't really know, because it's hard to walk into these companies and see what they're actually doing, and we don't know how much of it ends up at the user end. But by doing this and by tracking this over time, we will actually get a better sense of this, and then in addition being able to do small experiments experiments with these 1,000 participants to get a sense of what actually happens if you are in a filter bubble, or if you are being profiled with certain type of political messages, if we would feed more of those, or if we would feed countervailing messages. All of this, of course, since we are working with people from information law and a very heightened attention from the IRB and the ethical committees of the universities, obviously. But I think we'll also try to get a better grasp on some of the, say, empirical sides on this, on a topic which is very hard to study empirically. So thank you for that opportunity to advertise.
Okay, now we're gonna. Everything is gonna be tweet length from now on. There were three people in the front row waving for a while. They can ask really short questions, and then we answer really quick, and then cocktails, and we can, with a cocktail in the other room, continue our conversation.
Gabriela, you say that you cannot proceed political opinions because it's sensitive data. You say Facebook is a big player in Europe. Okay, so what's your best opinion or judgment? Is it legal that Facebook sell access to us on behalf of because of our political opinions? Because that's what's happening. Politicians are pouring money into Facebook because they can target us on our political opinions.
Similar to this question, related, when do we when do we stop to worry? So like, you've talked a lot about willing political behavior, but there's also a lot of unwilling political behavior, such the experiment by Facebook. There can be externalities which have the impact of influencing the electorate on one side or the other. So where do we stop to where do we draw this line?
Start or stop?
Define the line.
My question is again to the relation to free speech versus amendment issues. Isn't it actually, when you do only targeted messages, isn't that undermining the social purpose of free speech, as your position is no longer discussed in public? You talk to snowmobile owners about that, to abortion contrarians about that, and you take positions that may even be contrarious to each other in this targeted communication. I say that on the background that I just learned that in Germany there's apparently a big Russian-speaking group which are only listening to Russian language media, and so they have a completely separate political debate from what is happening in the rest of the public. And I'm sure in the US you have many language groups, so that can be very easily done there. And so my question is more to the US delegation. Thank you.
Okay, let's do it in this order.
Sure. No, I do think that I completely agree that this could undermine any ideal of a Habermasian public sphere, of having a public sphere that where we can, through the unforced force of argument, sort of have democratic will formation. Because of exactly the dangers that you've pointed out and some of the other questioners and panelists have pointed out. In terms of when do we stop worrying, I love that term, when do we stop the worrying and do something? I do think that at least a very first critical step is going to be to document what's going on, to document these types of interventions, because we do have very strong disclosure regulation for lots of other aspects of campaigns, so at least we should be disclosing like these types of experiments or other things. I do hope that in other legal orders where, than the US, there will be experimentation with targeted restrictions on them,
So from the standpoint of Facebook, I would say in working with Facebook on some different projects, I've always been surprised actually by how little information they actually get to use for some of their targeting in research projects. I think that Facebook is one of those companies that is super aware of what the implications are of things being found out of targeting. I am frankly more concerned about maybe other companies that are kind of have fewer social scientists in their midst that are more willing to kind of freely share information. I mean, Facebook is nice to kind of pick on from the standpoint of they're big and expansive, but in some ways, I have found them super collaborative with researchers.
Yes, just an answer, especially to the first question, because it's the one I can think of best. I'm one of those lawyers that think that ultimately courts are the ones that say, what is legal and what is illegal or unlawful, lawful, unlawful. As far as I am aware, but I did not do extensive research in this field, in this particular field. But I am aware of at least a court decision in the UK that from early 2000s, I think 2003, from the Information Tribunal, that decided political advertising, political profiling falls under the definition of direct marketing. And this, in terms of data protection law, means that you can object at any time with no justification whatsoever. If you say no to direct marketing, it has to stop, otherwise it's illegal. So I know there is a decision in the UK, about that. I am not aware of other court decisions, but I will be happy to explore some alternative arguments afterwards. Thank you.
I think that one thing that is completely unanswered at this point in time is what do we do with the direct behavioral targeting in the realm of politics in all those areas where we are spending public money in order to ensure the opposite. And that comes a little bit back to this idea of how do we organize the public sphere and our democratic process. So if, for example, public broadcasters who are funded in order to secure a certain time of political debate all of a sudden start to engage in profiling in terms of political news, are they then offering a better and an optimized public service, or are they undermining that very task that they were given to do? The same thing for political parties. They are in part funded, at least in the European context, by public funding in order to secure a public debate. If they engage in behavioral targeting, which ends up being multiple closed debates, are they then fulfilling the task on the basis of which they are receiving the funding? So while the jury may not be out even on what does all of this mean for voters and the effects on voters, I think there are also very many unanswered questions, especially on the funding side, but that is also where, to me as a non-lawyer, issues of disclosure and regulatory frameworks are easier to think about, maybe not to implement and control, we've seen that in the US case, but where some of these fundamental questions are being raised.
I really like Gabriela's point. I mean, borrowing from direct marketing regulation, I mean, one thing you see in the United States is telemarketers and some certain other types of marketers must retain copies of all the scripts they use, and sometimes even recordings of them, to deal with consumer protection problems. So you could imagine a world where one is allowed to kind of do whatever they want, but they have to keep an archive of the different messages that are being delivered to different populations. So direct marketing might be a place we could borrow from. But with that, we're out of time. There is so much more to say, but no time to cover it. I think our panelists are going to hang out if you have other questions or ideas about how to measure and think about this problem, or just to discuss whether you think it's a problem at all. So let's thank the panel, and we'll see you for drinks upstairs.